like this week to talk about the West, especially what I call the transformation of the West. And I can't imagine two more appropriate images to show you on the title card for this lecture than the ones we have here. On the left, you see a poster for Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World. Wild, rivalries, savage, barbarous, and civilized races is the subtitle. It is a poster, of course, for Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And I want to emphasize show because Buffalo Bill always insisted that the word show never be used when advertising his entertainment, that this was supposed to depict as close to as possible to a real Wild West environment. But of course, it was a show and it was full of myths, and it's one of those things that has stuck with the popular consciousness. All kinds of things, including the practice of circling the wagons, are really things that come out of the Buffalo Bill show, not out of reality. But it was extremely popular, the most popular entertainment for at least a decade in the late 19th century. And on the right is a man, a great leader for the Lakota in the West, and that is Red Cloud. Okay, negotiated as much as possible with the American government in order for he hoped the Lakota and other groups not to be exterminated. But I think really, if we have a focus question, it would be how was the West transformed economically and socially in this period? Capitalism advanced most quickly and dramatically in the trans-Mississippi West, whose lands now became absorbed by white settlers and whose resources became available for exploitation. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a lecture, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, in which he argued that the frontier had forged American culture's distinctive qualities as individual freedom, political democracy, and economic mobility. Turner argued that the frontier had been a safety valve which drew away from the dissatisfied East and therefore mitigated social unrest. Turner was very influential at the time, and he drew on long-standing notions that the West offered economic opportunity and freedom to newcomers. Many farmers, gold rush miners, and immigrants did find economic opportunity in the West, but there the accuracy of Turner's interpretation ended. Migrants to the West moved in groups, usually families, not as individuals. The West was not an empty space, but rather was inhabited by Native Americans who had to be dispossessed by whites for the frontier to be settled. And the West was not a paradise of small farms, but an area with industrial mining and agriculture, landlords, railroads, Mexican and Chinese contract laborers, and until the end of the Civil War, African American slaves. The West was also not a single area, but rather was incredibly diverse, ranging from the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains, the desert Southwest, the Sierra Nevada, and the verdant coasts and valleys of California and the Pacific Northwest. The political and economic incorporation of the American West was part of a global process. In many parts of the world, indigenous inhabitants were removed, often with fierce resistance. The West's incorporation into the United States required the federal government's intervention. The government acquired Indian land by purchase or force, regulated territories, and gave land and money to farmers, railroads, and mining companies. In the 20th century, the construction of federally financed irrigation systems and dams opened the West to commercial farming. And despite the myth of the West's rugged individualism, the area became part of the nation only by massive government activity. This is an advertisement, right, for railroads. Having been granted millions of acres of land by the federal governments and state governments, railroads sought to encourage immigration to the West by both Americans and immigrants so they could sell real estate to settlers. This brochure by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad Company circulated in Europe, and it advertised land in Nebraska in the Danish language. You may have to scroll in a bit to see that, but it's written in Danish, and these were distributed all over Denmark. More land came into cultivation in the 30 years after the Civil War than in the previous 2.5 centuries of American history. Settlers acquired farmlands through the Homestead Act, and more bought land from speculators and railroad companies that had been given public lands by the federal government. A vast agricultural belt growing wheat and corn for national and international markets emerged in the middle border, that is the Minnesota, Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas territories, with a diverse population of farmers who migrated from the east, from the south, and from Europe. Farming in this region was difficult, and much of the burden fell on women who faced severe isolation. The middle border's arid land required irrigation and thus made family farming difficult. But despite the emergence of a few large bonanza farms with thousands of acres and many agricultural wage workers, family farms prevailed. These farms increasingly grew for national and international markets and specialized in one crop. Railroads brought factory goods to rural farmers who became more dependent on banks for loans, on machinery, and products, and were subject to the ups and downs of international agricultural prices. American farms thus became part of a world market in which farmers across the globe faced ongoing crises as competition increased and prices declined. This is a photograph of the family of David Hilton on their Nebraska homestead in 1887. The Hiltons insisted on being photographed with their organ away from the modest sod house in which they live to represent their aspiration for prosperity. And here is an engraving from the early 1880s of a California farm adjacent to the Southern Pacific Railroad, which you can just see in the distance. Again, you probably have to scroll it. Having been granted vast tracts of land by the federal government, the railroad encouraged settlement along these lines. And here we have an engraving from 1876 called California Harvest Scene, Dr. Glenn's Farm in Colusa County. And it illustrates the large scale of operations and heavy investment in machinery common on western bonanza farms. In the late 1800s, California tried to attract immigrants by advertising its pleasant climate and the availability of land, although large-scale corporate farms were coming to dominate the state's agriculture. See, this ad is very much California, the cornucopia of the world. The decades after the Civil War also saw the golden age of cattle ranching and cowboys. Railroad stations at Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita, Kansas became destinations for now legendary cattle drives from Texas. The cowboys who worked the drives, a diverse group of white, Mexican, and black men, became icons of freedom and were immortalized in fiction and film. But their life was far from romantic. They were mostly low-paid wage workers, and the long-distance cattle drives ended by the 1890s, when farmers fenced in lands with barbed wire and severe winters killed millions of cattle. The cattle industry that reappeared was dominated by large ranches close to railroads. The West was also urban, with large cities such as San Francisco and the growth of other cities like Los Angeles due to tourism and oil. By 1890, a higher percentage of its population lived in cities than was the case in other regions. Large corporate enterprises dominated the West, and particularly industries such as lumber and mining and sheep farming in New Mexico. Independent owners and operators gave way to large corporate firms. Additionally, the lumber industry decimated coastal forests, and mining encouraged the sudden rise and fall of western towns. Chinese immigration, which began during the time of the California Gold Rush, continued into the post-war years. Prior to the Civil War, most immigrants had been single men, but by 1870, entire families began to immigrate. By 1880, 105,000 persons of Chinese descent lived in the United States, and three-quarters lived in California. Many immigrants worked on railroads and in mines. The growing presence of Chinese immigrants sparked an outpouring of anti-Chinese sentiment, leading to exclusionary immigration laws. In the 1840s, the Mormons moved to the Salt Lake area of the U.S. territory, now the capital of modern-day Utah. In 1857, after reports that Utah Territory's appointed governor, the Mormon leader Brigham Young, was interfering with federal judges in the area, President Buchanan removed Young and appointed a non-Mormon as governor. Young refused to comply, and federal troops were sent to occupy the territory and remained until the beginning of the Civil War. Conflict between Mormons and non-Mormons continued in the region, and during this period, the Mountain Meadows Massacre occurred, in which a group of Mormons attacked a group of non-Mormons traveling by wagon to settle in California. All adults and older children were killed, over 100 people, with only a few small children surviving. More than 2 decades later, one of the leaders of the raid was tried and sentenced for murder. Over the next few decades, tensions continued as Mormon communities moved to other areas of the American West, but much of the conflicts were similar to those with non-Mormon U.S. settlers in the region. For example, the Mormons saw the freewheeling lifestyles of cowboys as the embodiment of the immoral. In the 1880s, Mormon leaders sought to keep from further antagonizing the U.S. government by banning polygamy and wrote the ban into Utah's state constitution upon gaining statehood in 1896. Here's a good map of the industrial West. If you look down on the key, you can see major railroads, cattle trails, oil, citrus. Citrus was a huge industry, copper, timber, gold, iron ore, and silver, all over the West. Here's a photograph of Denver in the 1890s. Although generally thought of as a region of rural pioneers, the West, like the East, experienced rapid urbanization. And here's a family festival in San Juan, a town in Southern California, around 1880. Long after the area was annexed to the United States, the Spanish-speaking residents continued their religious and cultural practices. The West's incorporation into the American economy sealed the doom of the Plains Indians and their world. Their lives had already been changed by the horse, and Indian migrants to the West helped form the 19th century's great tribes, the Cheyenne, Comanche, Crow, Kiowa, and Sioux. Incessant warfare engulfed tribes and newcomers. Most whites moving to the Pacific experienced little hostility from the Plains Indians, but the settlement of lands there beginning in the 1850s brought bloody conflict. Although President Grant declared a peace policy in 1869, warfare soon resumed. Civil War generals such as Philip Sheridan attacked the basis of the Indian economy, destroying villages, horses, and the buffalo to end Indian resistance. By the 1880s, army campaigns and buffalo hunters had nearly eradicated the buffalo in the West. The Army subjugated one tribe after another, and in 1877, U.S. troops under O.O. Howard, the former commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, forced the Nez Perce to surrender and relocate from Oregon to an Oklahoma reservation. 2 years later, Chief Joseph, that tribe's leader, delivered a speech in Washington to President Rutherford B. Hayes and other notables, and that he protested the reservation policy and used the language of freedom strengthened by the Civil War and Reconstruction. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself. Native Americans sometimes inflicted great costs on American forces, most notably in 1876 at Little Bighorn, where Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse killed General George A. Custer and 250 of his men. In the Southwest, Appalachian leaders Cochise and Geronimo attacked white settlers and resisted Army units well into the 1880s when they surrendered. The Comanche, who had dominated other Indians in New Mexico and Colorado, also fell to American power in the 1870s. This is Albert Bierstadt's 1863 painting, The Rocky Mountains, Landers Peak. And again, this is one of these things where you're going to have to zoom in a little bit, but it shows Native Americans as an integral part of the landscape of the West. Here's a pencil and crayon drawing by a Cheyenne Indian from the 1880s, and it depicts a Native American fighting two black members of the U.S. military. After the Civil War, black soldiers, whose presence was resented by many whites in the North as well as in the South, were reassigned to the West and were often engaged in the Indian Wars. And here's the lithograph showing hunters shooting buffalo as the Kansas Pacific Railroad cuts across the West in the 1870s. Okay, now this is slightly exaggerated because buffalo don't usually charge onto the tracks, but lots of hunting parties used to be arranged in this way, and they'd come close enough to herds that they could shoot them. And here's a photograph of Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. Is a photograph probably taken in the late 1870s, maybe the end of 1879. This is when he was a part of a delegation to the nation's capital. Indians' idea of freedom resting on preserving their cultural and political autonomy and control of ancestral lands clashed with the values and interests of most white Americans. Nearly all believed that the federal government should persuade or force the Plains Indians to give up their land, their religion, their communal property, their nomadic way of life, and their gender relations, and adopt Christianity, adopt private properties, small farming on reservations, where men would work the fields and women would work in the home. In 1871, Congress ended the treaty system in which the government had negotiated agreements whereby Indian tribes were regarded as independent nations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs established boarding schools where Indian children, removed from their parents and tribes, were given new names and educated in white ways. In 1887, passage of the Dawes Act fragmented the lands of nearly all tribes into small parcels to be given to Indian families, with the rest of the land to be sold to white buyers. Indians who accepted the farms and, quote, adopted the habits of civilized life, end quote, would be offered American citizenship. Though the policy led to the loss of much tribal land and the erosion of Indian cultural traditions, whites benefited enormously, taking much of the best Indian lands, including much of Oklahoma. In the 50 years after the Dawes Act's passage, Indians lost 86 million of the 138 million acres they had possessed in 1887. Overall, according to one estimate, the United States had acquired over 1.5 billion acres of land from Native Americans. Many laws and treaties in the 19th century offered Indians the right to become American citizens if they left the tribal setting and assimilated into American society. But tribal identity was the one thing nearly every Indian wished to maintain, and very few took advantage of these offers. Thus, few Native Americans were recognized as American citizens. Western courts ruled that the rights guaranteed in the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th and 15th Amendments did not apply to them. In one of the most controversial rulings, Elk versus Wilkins, 1884, the Supreme Court agreed. It questioned whether any Indian had achieved the degree of civilization required of American citizens. By 1900, roughly 53,000 Indians had become American citizens by accepting land allotments under the Dawes Act. Finally, in 1924, Congress extended citizenship to all Native Americans, but their right to cast ballots remained contested. As late as 1948, Arizona and New Mexico did not allow Indians to vote. And here's a photograph depicting Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders visiting the White House in 1877 to meet President Hayes. This is a drawing called Between Two Worlds. It was produced in the 1870s by the Kiowa warrior Woha when he was a prisoner at Fort Marion, Florida. What he depicts here is himself being torn between his traditional way of life, represented by the buffalo, and the culture whites were trying to force him to adopt, symbolized by the steer and the tiny farmhouse. He later returned to the West and eventually served in the United States Army. This is a map of Indian reservations 1890. Okay. The vast majority of the remaining Indian population had been removed to reservations scattered across the western states. Many of these, or most of these, were in areas that were not very profitable, not very arable, right? Good farms are hard to come by. And that's one of the reasons they were turned into reservations. In the late 1880s, some Indians practiced the ghost dance, a religious movement to revitalize Indian life. Ghost dance leaders predicted that one day whites would disappear, the buffalo would return, and Indians would resume their cultural practices free from the ills introduced by whites. On December 29th, in 1890, large numbers of Indians gathered for singing, dancing, and religious ceremonies. When the government, fearing a revolt, sent troops to the reservations, soldiers opened fire on the ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, killing as many as 200 Indians, mostly women and children. It was viewed as a success by the press, and many soldiers involved later won the Medal of Honor. The massacre at Wounded Knee ended 4 centuries of armed conflict between Native Americans and European settlers and their descendants. By 1900, the Native American population had reached a low point of 250,000, but Indians survived and their numbers grew in the 20th century. The conquest of the West was part of a worldwide phenomenon in which settlers moved into the interior regions in temperate climates all over the globe, bringing familiar crops and livestock and starting mining and other industries. Argentina, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States are thus called settler societies because immigrants from overseas rapidly outnumbered and displaced original inhabitants, unlike in India and much of colonial Africa, where only a few Europeans managed to dominate entire societies. Some settler societies, including those in Canada and Australia, removed indigenous people from their lands and attempted to replace their traditional cultural practices. In 2008, forced removal of Aboriginal children in Australia led to a National Day of Apology. Now, the West has played many roles in Americans' national self-conscious. It's been imagined as a place of individual freedom and endless opportunity, but also as a lawless place ruled by cowboys and Native Americans. This Wild West was marked by gunfights, cattle drives, stagecoach robberies, and this image was later solidified by Hollywood movies, but was first disseminated in vaudeville shows in the late 19th century. An important figure in the creation of the Wild West was William Buffalo Bill Cody, who developed an elaborate theatrical presentation that toured the United States and Europe for decades. Buffalo Bill's Wild West had battle reenactments, including Little Bighorn, Indian rituals, sharpshooting demonstrations, including Annie Oakley. In addition to the shows, the image of the Wild West circulated in popular novels and sensational journal accounts. Overall, the Wild West of the American imagination did not account for the industrial development and the diversity of the region's population. Here's a horse sculpture. It's one of the masterpieces of Native American art. It's a 3-foot-long wooden sculpture carved by a Lakota Sioux around 1870, and it honors a dead or wounded horse. It has horsehair mane and tail and leather reins on a bridle, and there are holes representing bullet wounds on the torso and red paint representing blood. The horse may be leaping from life to death. That's why it's in the position it's in. This is boys from the Lakota tribe on arrival at the Carlisle boarding school, a boarding school that aimed to civilize Indians. This is a picture taken by a local Carlisle photographer named J.N. Choate. He made photographs for the Carlisle school. Okay, notice their traditional dress, and then notice how this changes in the next picture. These are boys from the Lakota tribe during their stay at the Carlisle boarding school, right, where they've been, at least in terms of clothing, there's been an attempt to civilize them and make them adopt white ways. Again, same photographer, same process, deliberately showing boys before and after, if you will. Here's a 1911 poster advertising the federal government's sale of land formerly possessed by Native Americans. Under the Dawes Act of 1887, Indian families were allotted farms, and the remaining land on reservations, so-called surplus land, was made available to whites. And here's the ghost dance performed by a group of Sioux Indians, depicted by the artist Frederick Remington in Harper's Weekly, December 6, 1890. And finally, I wanted to give you an actual picture, not a painting or poster, of William Buffalo Bill Cody. And here he's with the Native American leader, Sitting Bull. They both appeared in Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which brought a romantic image of the West to audiences in the East and even in Europe.